Hello and welcome to The Print. We have yet another edition of The Print soft cover. And today we are going to discuss about a book that is on Afghanistan, which is there in top of everyone's mind. And here we have both the authors who are also journalists. So be rest assured, this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Welcome to The Print, Ananth, and welcome to The Print also, Stanley. How are you?
Thank you, Nayanima. Thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you. I don't know if you have the copy of the book, but we have nicely packed it. And,
I have one here. Yeah. Okay, here's the cover to show you. Yes, all right.
Unveil it for you. Stanley, do you have a copy with you?
No, I don't have it right now with me.
But I
unfortunately, thanks for wrapping it up so nicely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So this is the Comrades and the Mullahs, China, Afghanistan, and the new Asian geopolitics. Fantastic. So HarperCollins publication, of course, it's a fascinating cover and also a fascinating, the title of the book. So how did it happen, and was it really planned, or this is something I'm sure you wrote in a very short span of time right after, Kabul fell on 15th of August, and then you had to, conceptualize it. So Ananth, if you can start, how did you think about it? And of course, I'll then next come to you, Stanley.
Sure. I think that Stanley and I think this is an answer I leave to Stanley because I have to confess that this is his title, actually. And there's a funny story in how the whole idea actually came from this phrase of the Comrades and the Mullahs. And Stanley will be able to tell your viewers about that. But we did have conversations before the fall of Kabul, actually. And I think that it was in July. Around June, July was when we started talking about it. And started working through it. So I think that we, like most people, didn't expect things to be as dramatic as they were, because if you remember at the time, Nayanima, since you were there, if I recall,
yes,
you were in Kabul, and most estimates said it's going to be weeks or months. So we thought we'd have weeks or months.
Yeah.
But everyone was completely taken aback in terms of the collapse and the speed of the fall of Kabul. So we had to write faster, but it was something we were thinking about. I'll leave that to Stanley to flesh out, but we were thinking about it before that happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. And Stanley, as Ananth said, that you had the title of the book already in your head. So how did it really come about, the Comrades and the Mullahs? How good the friendship is going to be.
Yeah, the funny story behind the title is that this was an instinctive tweet when Mullah Baradar went to China and met the Chinese leaders. There was a stunning photograph. One of the photos is the cover. There was another cover where Baradar was being welcomed by the Chinese foreign minister with an open hands. So I tweeted the Comrade and the Mullah. So Swati Chopra, who is the executive editor of HarperCollins, said that this can be the title of a book. Still, it didn't strike me. I didn't know that we were going to do the book. Then Ananth joined in saying that, why can't we do it, Stanley? Yeah. So only then, it struck us because, Ananth has been reporting on China. Everybody knows that for quite some time. I was following on the developments in the Muslim world and Afghanistan and the Middle East. And then we had a conversation, me and Ananth had a conversation. So Ananth told me that he thinks there is a cracking book about the developments in Afghanistan. Yeah, but at that time, Kabul hadn't fallen. And then we prepared a synopsis. And interestingly, when we prepared the synopsis, even the American intelligence estimates were saying that the Kabul government would last up to 6 months. So we were speculating the scenario of what is next for the government of Kabul. But by the time we started writing the book, Kabul had fallen. So we had certainty, at least what happened to the government in Kabul, and then we replanned it accordingly. And the book was written in 6 months, less than 6 months' time.
Wow, that's a record in itself, I believe. But if I can ask both of you, what is it that you finally found out from the book? In the sense, did you expect, and as Ananth said, that this was really unexpected. We were all going with certain estimates that, Kabul will probably fall in 6 months, 3 months. At least for me, it was like the very next day it happened. I didn't know what to do. But when it happened, did you really think that the Chinese will come so close to the Taliban government because, end of the day, they believe in doing business. They believe in making money. So how was it, Ananth? And probably then Stanley, you can tell me.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, Nayanima, since we're right now talking when the whole world's attention's on Ukraine, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers are thinking about Ukraine now, and Afghanistan has kind of fallen off the sort of radar. But one of the things that kind of struck me in terms of, there's been a lot of attention and debate on China's stand on how it's sort of approaching Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there's been a lot of debate, discussion, I'd say in the West, even confusion. I think that one of the things that struck me is how similar the Chinese sort of responses to these two different events have been. And I think that if people who read our book won't be surprised at all in terms of how China has reacted to Ukraine, because there's one very important common thread that informs their reaction to both Afghanistan and Ukraine. And this is how important it is for them, this idea of the decline of the West, and this notion that Western hegemony, as they put it, is in an inevitable, irreversible decline. And that's something that I've seen when I was based in China from 2008 onwards, following the global financial crisis. And that's an idea that's taken a lot more emphasis under Xi Jinping, who took over in 2012. And I think that this is something we write in the book as well, in terms of how the US exit and the manner of the US exit for them really reinforced this idea that Chinese thinkers have been talking about. And you see that's why they support Russia as well, because I think if you want to understand Chinese foreign policy and Chinese goals, this prism of their competition with the US and their feeling that this is, as Xi Jinping put it, a once in a century opportunity for China. I think that really informs a reaction to both. And the second sort of, I think, really important driving force, which you hinted at in your question, in the book, we call it ruthless pragmatism, which is that they will do what they need to do to advance their interests. And in this case, it means dealing with a regime which makes them very uncomfortable. And we look at that in the book, in terms of their own dealings with Islam within China and the contradictions of that. So I think these two ideas are really, really important in understanding Chinese foreign policy and motivations, whether you're talking about Ukraine or whether you're talking about Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Sure, Stanley, if you can tell us, as what I had asked Ananth, and also, was it expected from the Chinese side? I mean, irrespective of which government comes in Kabul, the Chinese will behave in a certain way.
So if you look at the way China was dealing with the Taliban, at least you could say that the Chinese were inclined towards dealing with the Taliban even before Kabul had fallen. So that is, it was there. If you look at how the Chinese had actually, the Chinese representative was present back in 2015 when Islamabad had hosted peace negotiations between Kabul and the Taliban. Both the Obama administration as well as the Chinese government had sent representatives. So China had shown, at least from that time, that it was willing to engage with the Taliban, because there was a little bit of unpredictability there. What would happen next? Everybody knew that the United States was trying to get out of Afghanistan. The US wanted an agreement, a face-saving exit from Afghanistan. So the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, all these countries, Russia was forced out of Afghanistan, Soviet Union was forced out of Afghanistan in 1989. Iran had almost gone to a war with the Taliban back in the late 1990s. And China was sitting on the fence even when the Taliban were in power last time. It was not very comfortable with the Taliban. So, but these countries, all three are important Eurasian continental powers. But you can see that all these three countries were slowly, or at least they were willing to deal with the Taliban. They were waiting to see what, they were ready to deal with an eventuality of the Taliban coming back to power in Afghanistan. So you could see those changes in their approaches. So yeah, and when it actually happened, I think since the diplomatic groundwork was already laid out, and China, as Ananth pointed out, was also looking at the United States withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan through the prism of the changes, the larger changes that were underway in the global politics. So the Chinese, let's say, reluctantly moved in.
Mm-hmm. So if I can ask you, Stanley, I mean, good that you spoke about the history of it. But now when we talk about recognition, I mean, at least for me, I feel this conversation is so futile because, at least as per my opinion, the recognition came when Trump administration signed a peace deal with Taliban. Now,
Yeah.
when countries are talking about recognition coming with this many conditions, isn't it a little bit hypocritical, or do you think they are right in doing so, in demanding for all those conditions to be met?
Yeah, I think the United States approach towards Taliban was, in the book we try to trace the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan. So not from 2001, we trace it back to the Soviet days,
Correct.
the Soviet intervention days. And eventually we can see, yes, Obama had sent a representative for talks, but it was actually Trump administration which appointed a special envoy, held direct negotiations with the Taliban. Not just that, they held direct negotiations with the Taliban, bypassing the government in Afghanistan, because the Taliban did not want the Kabul government to take part in the negotiations, and the United States actually agreed to that. So you can see that the US had made a lot of concessions to the Taliban during the process. And, Trump was even ready to welcome the Taliban leaders to the United States. So it was there. I mean, it was very evident that the United States had taken these policies. And now, once the Taliban are back in power, yeah, we can say that it's hypocritical. But at the same time, I think at least the countries in the region, we don't know what the United States would do next. But at least the countries in the Asian in Asia. So for them, I think it is they would wait and see what would happen to the Taliban regime, because back in 2001, if you look at the fall of the Taliban, in the first couple of years, 2-3 years, basically the new Afghan government, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, everybody thought that the government was actually standing up or picking up roots. And you saw an almost stable Afghanistan, with the backing of the United States. But then everything started collapsing. So I think it's too early for all these countries to take a firm position towards the Taliban regime, because now that the winter is receding, this is the time for the traditional spring offensive in Afghanistan. So there is now you can see two set of armed opposition to the Taliban. One is, of course, the earlier Northern Alliance, and then you have the Islamic State is also picking up space in eastern Afghanistan. So I think from a real political point of view, whether it is the United States or Iran or Russia, China is ready to deal with the Taliban, but even Chinese are not ready to offer diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. So I think everybody is following this wait and watch game at this point of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ananth, if I can ask you, what is the thinking going on in the Chinese psyche, in the Chinese mind, since you are there and you read all these Chinese publications and everything that they have to offer, whatever is there publicly that they can offer? What is the thinking going on, especially now when a lot is being talked about this Russian aggression over Ukraine, how people will view it, whether the war was long going on? So in that aspect, what is the Chinese thinking on what the Taliban government will be? Is there a future, or are they there again for 5-6 years and it'll be all gone?
No, that's trying to answer that question was what actually got me interested in this project in the first place, because I found there were so many different views and debates actually in China. And that's something that we trace in quite detail in the book. Initially, the first reaction was pretty much Schadenfreude at US exit. So there's a lot of sort of chest thumping and saying that, the shows America, comparing it to the fall of Saigon and pretty much, celebrating the US exit. But actually, a lot of that was just hype. And I think a lot of foreign observers misread that as real Chinese intent to actually go in a big way, but that wasn't it. It was more just like a propaganda victory and telling their own people this message of, Western decline. But actually, if you separate that, the heart of the Chinese response is still pretty cautious. And one of the arguments we make in the book, that it's security of their Western borders, of their Western frontiers, of Xinjiang, more than going in a big way, is what still drives their calculus. And we do spend quite a lot of time on Xinjiang and explaining how it became such a volatile place and how the Xinjiang border is something that they're so concerned about. And I think that the point that they also want to make is, as much as they kind of celebrate this Western exit, they see themselves as being a very different kind of power from the West. I think you see that in a lot of their dealings. And right off the bat, the first is not having preconditions. They might find many of the things the Taliban does to be disagreeable, but it isn't their way to go in and tell them that we won't give you aid if you say don't have enough women representation in your cabinet. That's not how the Chinese work, and you know that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's going to really inform the way they do business is extremely different. They see themselves as being a different power, but at the same time, I should add that one thing that you see in a lot of Chinese writings, they spend so much time in terms of reflecting on the lessons from what the West does and the mistakes they shouldn't repeat. And so for instance, if you're thinking about Chinese boots on the ground, that's something nobody even is advocating for. Even if you look at Chinese going in to tap mineral resources, as Stanley said, it's still an approach that's saying, listen, yes, there's a lot that can be tapped, but we need to wait. We're not going to sink in money until the situation is clearer and until the situation stabilizes. So I think if I had to take one sort of important message from the debates you see in the Chinese press, especially regarding Afghanistan, is that they see themselves as being a very different power and not repeating the mistakes that they see the West making.
Mm-hmm. And what is the kind of concerns that they really have on this ETIM? We've heard a lot, in Delhi, when there was no point to make for the ME, they would say that look at the Chinese, they are also concerned. But are they really concerned with the ETIM? And if that is so, then how big that concern is, to the extent that they would not recognize the Taliban government? And also, as your book suggested, and that you have really nicely played, both of you, in the sense that how the Chinese are now planning to put and deploy Chinese forces in that border. So if you can share something on that, Ananth.
Sure, I'll just share a bit before Stanley comes in. But I think the ETIM is more a potential future threat rather than a current threat. I think the Chinese, as I mentioned in the book as well, they tend to frame every little incident in Xinjiang and protest as being terrorism or separatism, mm-hmm. where so far a lot of the violence you've seen in Xinjiang is very different from Kashmir, where you haven't had cases in Xinjiang of, say, cross-border terrorism, people who are infiltrating with grenades, guns, and the like. A lot of it is the attacks you've seen have been sort of very unsophisticated, crude attacks with homemade bombs and knives and the like. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that what really concerned them was, I think around 7-8 years ago, there was evidence that there were several thousand Uyghurs who had been found in Syria. Mm. And I think that there's a very big concern that they had was what is going to happen to these 4,000-5,000 people eventually who have been trained abroad, and how do they deal with them coming back? We reported on some internal speeches that Xi Jinping gave to members of the party, where he actually said that the most sort of big threat that they were facing, he never said this publicly, but he actually said people coming in from Pakistan and Afghanistan. Imagine a Chinese leader speaking about Pakistan being as a threat to stability, just something that he said privately. And I think that's a genuine concern that they have, which is why they've been leaning heavily on Pakistan and Afghanistan to crack down on the ETIM. But it also very quickly, Nayanima, it also explains, in India, we often wonder, why do they have this double standard on terrorism, where they back all these Pakistani terrorists at the UN Security Council, but they're worried about the ETIM. We explain that in the book as well, where they feel as long as Pakistan is cracking down on their groups that they're worried about, they're happy to look away when it's somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, Stanley. Now, if I can ask you, since you closely watch the Muslim world, right from Pakistan to Iran to the other Middle Eastern countries, How do you see they are looking into it in this Taliban 2.0, if I can say so? In the chapter, the general's proxies, you bring out some nice, interesting precedents. But how do you see this really panning out, especially after, maybe the Ukraine war? Whenever it is over, it is bound to have some kind of impact on all of these, right?
Yeah, I think for Pakistan, this is as much an opportunity as a dilemma or a challenge. Because, of course, we knew that the Pakistanis were supporting the Taliban. So we tried to reconstruct that history in general proxies, so right from 2001. And the Taliban's return to power for Pakistan from a Pakistani point of view actually adds to their strategic depth. Because when the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was there, the Pakistanis feared that they are being encircled by India and a pro-Indian government in Kabul.
Right.
And they always saw that they wanted a pro-regime, a pro-Pakistani regime. They always wanted a pro-Pakistan regime, pro-Islamabad regime in Afghanistan. And they achieved it when the Taliban came back to power and the Taliban captured power in 1996. So the Taliban's return to power from that point of view, if you look at it from a strategic point of view, that is a victory, strategic victory for Pakistan. But at the same time, you see what happened on the security front ever since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. The collapse of the government, the Taliban's return to power, that actually turned the Islamic State into the main Islamist armed insurgency or opposition towards the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And the Islamic State is present in eastern Afghanistan, and it is also spreading its influence across the border to Pakistan, which we saw in the Peshawar blast, last week, 1 week ago. So what we call it the wheel of jihad, it can, come back to Pakistan. The Pakistanis had suffered this earlier. And the problem is that Pakistan supported the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, to capture power in Kabul. But at the same time, the Pakistanis are fighting the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. But the Pakistani Taliban. But the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban are basically ideological brothers.
Absolutely.
You might find some organizational difference, but ideologically looking, they are brothers. So this is the challenge Pakistan is going to face, because they want the Taliban regime in Kabul, which they think from a strategic point of view would add to their strategic depth. But at the same time, from an internal security point of view, the return of the Taliban to Kabul will definitely strengthen the Pakistani Taliban inside Pakistan. And it is also, with the fall of security or with an added narrative, the Islamic State is also trying to gain further momentum in the Pak region, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. So this is adding challenges to Pakistan. But from Iran's point of view, I think, Iran is taking a more realistic view, because Iran, given a chance, I don't think Iran wants a Taliban regime. Iran is a Shia theocratic regime, and it doesn't want a Sunni Deobandi regime across its border, of course. And it also faces the problem of refugees. But at the same time, it accepts this as a reality, and Iran is ready to live with that reality without offering any kind of direct recognition to the Taliban. I was in Tehran last week, and I talked to some of the foreign ministry officials. So they were saying that they don't consider the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, legitimate rulers of Afghanistan, because there was no proper process, no electoral process, or no peace between the different factions of the Afghan society. So the Iranians say the Taliban represent a section of the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns themselves are not a majority, or not an overwhelming majority in Afghanistan, which is a divided country. And even among Pashtuns, the Taliban represent a fraction of Pashtun. So the Iranians think that the Taliban do not have the legitimacy to rule Afghanistan. So this is an interim government. That's how they look at it, which could lead in the future to a more inclusive or more legitimate government. But at the same time, they think that, this is a reality. They will have to work with the Taliban. So I think these are the different approaches the countries and the main countries in the region are taking.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You talk about that, Stanley, and since you said that you'd gone to Iran, I'll ask you, and then I'll of course come to Ananth. On this, the question about the resistance movement. Now, what is it that we are currently hearing, at least in Delhi, is that movement is gone. Maybe there'll be some kind of noise now that that spring season is coming and that is when they come out. But do you really see there is any life left with the resistance movement? What's happening to that?
I think it's hard to predict, but I can certainly say that it's not over. Like you have a resistance movement, which is now based in other countries, and in Tajikistan, it would be in Tajikistan. But it's not over. The Taliban's legitimacy, Taliban is not going to get, that kind of a legitimacy anytime soon, I think. And it would, a lot would depend on how Taliban is going to consolidate its position within Afghanistan going forward, whether it would be easier for the Taliban or whether it would make it difficult for the Taliban, that we have to see. So I think if the Taliban fails to consolidate its position within Afghanistan, because there are natural discontents in Afghanistan, it is a divided country, and Taliban has come up with a Pashtun men-only government. So there are Tajiks are there, Uzbeks are there, and the Shia Hazaras are there. They all have a tradition of fighting the central government in Kabul. They all had their own militia groups in the past. So if the Taliban failed to consolidate its position, I think it is possible that different kind of resistance to come up. And Tajikistan is definitely not happy with the Taliban. The Iranians are also not happy with the way the Taliban formed the government. But I think they all are now waiting to see whether the Taliban would be able to consolidate its position within Afghanistan. If it doesn't, I think even the Indians have their own concern about the Taliban, and India has security concerns about the Taliban. And in the past, we know, Nayanima, we all know that how India, Iran, and even Russia and Central Asian republics all came together to support the Northern Alliance. And a rump of the Northern Alliance is still there. So, yeah, definitely, it is not the Northern Alliance of the 1996. That's true. But at the same time, the resistance is not completely over.
Ananth, you would like to answer that?
Yes, I think that just to add in a little bit of perspective from the Chinese point of view, one of the things that we point out in the book is actually they did not want to see the Taliban coming back in this unrestrained kind of way. I think it puts them in a difficult position as well. And I think ideally what they wanted to see, where I think would have suited the Chinese interests the best, was if there was some kind of power sharing arrangement where they had different kind of a diffusion of power and they had the ability to kind of play one off the other. In the book, we talk about the fact that, there's a lot of attention of the Chinese hosting the Taliban delegation in China in end July 2021. But what was also happening, which got much less attention, was Xi Jinping was on the phone with Ghani.
Right.
And so I think they had invested quite a lot in Ghani as well. And I think that their ideal scenario would have been a situation where you had some kind of arrangement. Obviously, you had stability, but you kind of had some kind of arrangement that allowed them to not be completely dependent on one power center, which is, I think, they didn't want at all. And we also look in quite some detail on China's experience with Taliban 1.0, and they had a bad experience with Taliban 1.0. So this was not, even if they're trying to sort of make the best of it right now, frankly, this was not what they wanted to see as well. And I think they'd be waiting to see how things pan out in the next year as well. And they wouldn't find it to be as much as they don't want instability, they don't want a civil war. I think the ideal scenario would have been a situation where you had different parties at the same table.
That's interesting, Ananth. So just to wind up, last questions to both of you, and it's a similar question. What about this factor about good terrorists and bad terrorists? This is something we've been constantly hearing for decades now. Does that argument hold true? Ananth, I'll go to you first, and then Stanley will wind that up.
Yeah, sure. I think we titled the chapter "Good Terrorists and Bad Terrorists" just to point out the kind of.
I think that's the first chapter readers will vote. At least I did.
Yeah, just to point out the hypocrisy of all of it in terms of, especially, I think as an Indian reporter in Beijing, I spent many months reporting on the repeated technical holes and vetoes of every time India puts up somebody at the UN Security Council and the Chinese put a hold. And then you also have the Chinese saying they are victims of terrorism and what's happening in Xinjiang. And then you have this kind of effort, which we speak about how they've been quietly rebranding the Taliban at home where initially they portrayed them as being these Islamist hardliners, but when they came to power, they started saying, oh, they're grassroots sons of the soil. So just goes to show that it's interests at the end of the day that matter.
Interesting. Stanley, what is your response to that?
The same. I mean, from a moral point of view, there is no difference. But if you look at it from real politics, you can see that great powers differentiate between different extremist groups. For the Chinese, PTIM is a terrorist group, but the Taliban could be, they are ready to engage or deal with the Taliban. For the Pakistanis, Afghan Taliban is okay, they are proxies, but the Taliban within Pakistan are terrorists. Or for them, the anti-India terrorist groups are okay. They have been supporting them. But the groups that are fighting the Pakistani state is a terrorist group. For the United States, Al Qaeda is a terrorist group. Taliban was an extremist group, but they were also ready to engage the Taliban, sign an agreement with the Taliban. So yeah, from a real political point of view, you can see all these countries are taking different positions towards different extremist groups.
Sure. Well, we can continue this conversation for hours, but we need to really wind it up. So this is the book. I will urge viewers to go ahead and grab a copy of this. It's very easy reading, of course, because journalists have written it after all. So the Comrades and the Mullahs, China, Afghanistan, and the New Asian Geopolitics. It's a HarperCollins publication. And thank you, Ananth. Thank you, Stanley. It's fascinating to talk to you, and congratulations again on the book. Please take care.
Thank you, Nayanima. Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.